On to our next presentation, which Richard was talking about. This is Brian Vries with Let's Kick Ass, and Brian's presentation is on friendships. What are friendships for? Brian has pre-recorded this today, and we are going to run this session now.
About something about which I'm really interested and passionate, and I think that might be true for more of us. So I've been asked to talk about friendship, and I'll have a particular focus on LGBT persons and the second half of life. Just a bit of background. I kind of came into this area both personally and professionally. I'm the youngest child and the only gay child of a large family of people who immigrated to Canada. So I'm a first generation Canadian. I'm also a dual citizen. I'm the only gay person in our family. My parents emigrated after having served in the underground during the Second World War in the Netherlands. Came to Canada, struggled for a bit, and my father became an Anglican minister. And as a consequence, we moved around a lot. I mentioned all of that because I think all of those play into how I view friends and the nature of friendship kind of in my life. And the impact it's had both on me personally and professionally. And so I came to observe, I think, and understand friendship in the ways I have based on those sorts of experiences. And those observations include a sense of the cultural ambiguity with which friendship is seen, I think, in North American society. I want to be able to say more about that, but it's as if friendship is both hugged and slapped at the same time. That's kind of the impression I get of friendship. And notwithstanding that, there's been a fair amount of research on friendship, mostly focusing on kind of the benefits of having friends for individuals across the life course and of different sexual orientations, gender identities. But I'd like to take a particular focus on LGBT persons and make reference when I can to some of the research that's been done on older persons living with HIV/AIDS. With that as a backdrop, I'd like to encourage us to kind of shift the focus a bit from the more traditional way in which friendship has been seen to one of the other ways in which friendship exists that I think offers more potential for us to both develop friendships and to grow. And so it's through that into next steps that where I'd like to end the talk. So that's kind of the plan of what I hope for this afternoon, this morning. If we turn to culture, and this speaks a lot, I think, of my life, that the first thing about culture is movies. But I think movies represent, in movies, there's a pretty strong representation of friendship. I've just taken 3 posters here of movies that sort of came to my mind, and there's many others, but this is sort of explicit reference of friendship in movies, Between Friends, My Best Friend's Wedding, Love and Friendship. A more implicit representation of friendship in movies is even more prominent. Here, for example, The Green Book, The Big Chill, Thelma and Louise, and I bet you could come up with dozens of others, the primary focus of which is friendship. And so friendship has a pretty strong presence in movies as well as in television. Friends, of course, would probably first come to mind, a movie with the name of the object of our research, but so too is Sex and the City, The Big Bang Theory, Seinfeld, Will and Grace, for example, Frankie and Grace, or Grace and Frankie, is it? But that there's, again, an even larger representation of friendship on popular television programs. So too can we see friendship in literature and in popular media. It's a bit different in this context. When I've looked through kind of the sources of of friendship in media, I would say the bulk of the books available are children's books on friendship, and often how to become friends or how to make friends. Second most frequent would probably be books on women's friendships. They're also not infrequent, and women have a pretty strong voice in this literature, um, and also are the authors of the third category, which is self-help books on friendship. So the literature on friendship is mostly geared to children or to women and in understanding and developing friendships. Probably the mother lode, though, for me, of friendship in culture is represented in music. And my guess is that I'm embedding an earworm here, because for me, whenever I hear songs, the minute friend is mentioned or referenced, I kind of perk up a bit. And it's in large proportion of popular music. Here are just a dozen or 15 titles arranged in this kind of word salad way of friendship in popular songs, from "You're My Best Friend" to "My Old Friend," "Whenever I Call You Friend," "Thank You for Being a Friend," and the Golden Girls, "You Gotta Have Friends." Bette Midler has sung quite a few of these, by the way, to "Whenever I Call You," to "That's What Friends Are For." So the goal here of these last few slides is really kind of just to let to represent the extent to which friendship is kind of deeply embedded and prominent in North American culture. And I use that to contrast the way in which friendship is kind of poorly treated in more formal cultural representations. For example, think of the language we have to talk about our friends. And this represents a study done that tried to characterize the range of terms that people use for friends. And it's a pretty clumsy language, as you can see. There's acquaintance and friend, and then close friend and best friend. Best friend itself, always I struggle with, because it kind of implies worse friends and commodifies or makes competitive something that's inherently not intended to be. But it's a pretty clumsy short list, particularly when you pair that against the language we have for family. Just think of all the terms we have for different family representatives, from parent, child, sibling, grandparent, grandchild, cousins, along a far range for second, third, nieces, nephews. You see the list there, and this is a partial list. So the language and the terms we have for family relationships really far outweighs, you see, the kind of pitiful few terms that seem available for friendship. Moreover, there's different ways in which family relationships have been characterized, from matrifocal to patrifocal, mother or father focused, nuclear or avuncular, sort of, the parent-child relationship, to the grandparent-headed family, extended kin or fictive or honorary kin. So just that contrast is meant to really represent the preference for family in North American culture. We see that in a variety of other ways. I mentioned to you my Canadian citizenship and birthright. I do a lot of research continuing in Canada with colleagues, mostly on end of life issues amongst LGBT persons. And from that, I was made aware of a list in British Columbia that is intended to help, with a question mark, I suspect, people identify who would be your decision maker should you come to a time where you're unable to make a decision, or to assist those who are in charge of your in charge of your care, about to whom they would turn as a decision maker in your absence. So in British Columbia, the government has proposed this as a list of temporary substitute decision makers in the order in which they could be approached. And you see, it's heavily, heavily dominated by family. I've highlighted a close friend, the 8th out of 9 potential candidates, following, quote, anyone else related to you by birth or adoption. So it's as if you exhaust every possible family tie there ever could be, then you could go to a friend. So friend feels like it's given a bit of short shrift there. We see that in other characteristics in other settings as well. In clinical and healthcare settings, for example, this is an interesting point that was raised by a colleague of mine, Rosemary Bleasner. She said, if, you know, in a family relationship, in a couple relationship, you have a conflict, there's a family and couples therapist, right, to whom you could turn to assist for support. You have a conflict with friend, kind of too bad, you're on your own. There isn't a dedicated friendship therapist. Hospital settings too have sort of overlooked friends, although that has changed. But I bet so many of us think back to younger years when friends were in the hospital and we had to be some distant cousin just to get in the door, right? Family was given preference. Friends were kind of left at the outside. We've seen that in a variety of other studies too. A colleague, Judith Barker, has studied friend as caregivers. And about 10% of a sort of any population of caregivers are non-family members. So they're probably friends and neighbors. The distinction between those two is unclear. But in her research, she found that these were willing and loving persons providing care to a friend, doing every bit as much as family, but against a backdrop of suspicious healthcare providers. Many, that's overstating it, several of them were brought to probate court by these healthcare providers, doubting the authenticity of the care they are providing. Really, these healthcare providers were asking the friends, what are you doing here really? So very suspicious of the nature of the relationship. Mark Brennan-Ing, who I bet is known to many of you, a colleague of mine, has done a fair bit of research on friend caregivers to persons living with HIV/AIDS, and particularly the samples in New York and Chicago found that these friend-centric caregivers provide care every bit as competent as family caregivers, yet they do so in this context of kind of doubts of their authenticity, suspicions of their reasons for being there. Finally, I don't mean to flog this too much, but friendships and funerals, that friends play roles in funerals to the extent that families permit them to, right? So there's some of my research on bereavement, and there's a 600 or 700 page volume of the Handbook of Bereavement that covers all of the research in this area. If you go to the index and look under friend as grievers, it's not listed. Friend is only listed as support to the bereft. It's as if the only role for friend is to support those who are, quote, entitled to their grief. So there's a kind of institutional formal disregard for friends across a range of healthcare and clinical settings, and even in the sort of government sanctioned decision makers that they offer as importantly assistance to individuals. I mentioned all of that really to provide a context. And the context is that of the mixed message of friendship. Friendship's important, but just not as important as family. And it kind of reinforces the message many of us received as kids. That is, what happens when a friend moves away or we lose a friend? We're told to make a new one. And the message there is kind of a notion of interchangeability. And so for me, I've come to think of friendship as the Rodney Dangerfield of relationships. It gets no respect, but it deserves respect, in part by virtue of some of the research that point to the many benefits of friendship, to which I'll turn now. Here, this is just a summary of dozens of studies, many of which are large-scale research projects internationally, focusing on, quote, the benefits of friendship. Let's turn to the first, mental health. A variety of studies have found that friendship ties are stronger predictors of better mental health, particularly depression, reduced depression, than ties with other relatives. Even in bereavement, we've found in several large studies that connections to friends are better indicators of mental health and adaptation to grief than our connections to family. Another set of studies have found that relationships with friends increase positive affect, and improve life satisfaction. When that's compared with relationships with family, it's been found that family relationships also improve positive affect, but they also increase negative affect and have no impact on satisfaction. So both of these cases, friendships has more to contribute to emotional well-being. We've seen lots of studies that show friendship reduces loneliness, isolation, creates a sense of belongingness. Several recent studies have found that relational closeness, particularly with friends, is important for in maintaining cognitive functioning in later life. Idea of being exposed to different perspectives, other worldviews, and a large study out of Australia quite a few years ago that's now been replicated shows that those with strong connections to friends live longer than those without such connections. So the role of friends has a pretty strong presence and valence in the well-being of individuals. That's probably particularly true for LGBT persons and others whose lives kind of fall outside of traditional heteronormative modes. If we look at family absent context, for example, and that could be from rejection of individuals by their family or by individuals of their family, or alienation, just growing distant. In either case, that there's sadly great prevalence of family absence or a lack of presence in the lives of older LGBT people. And as a consequence, research has looked at the extent to which LGBT people turn to their friends. And the notion of chosen family has kind of been given a lot of play lately of how we as LGBT people create our own family out of the friends who are important to us in our lives. Armistead Maupin spoke of that as logical kin, I think in a clever play of words, as in contrast to biological kin. So my logical kin are my friends, notwithstanding my biological family. In a large study we did now over 10 years ago of over 2,100 US adults, about half of whom were LGBT and all were boomers. 2/3 of our LGBT sample said they had a chosen family. So it's a sizable number. We don't know enough about chosen families. I want to say that I think it's an important area to study, but perhaps we choose dysfunctional families to replicate the families with which we're familiar, right? So chosen family in and of itself, I think needs to be unpacked a bit, but we do know that there are a lot of positive elements from that same national study. For example, on the right-hand side here, we see that LGBT people relative to general population, 93% of whom are heterosexual, are far more likely to seek out advice, emergency support, encouragement, assistance with errands, and to confide with their friends than are heterosexual people. So there's a greater connection to friends amongst LGBT than amongst comparably aged heterosexual people, boomers in this case. I turn now to a study we did last summer with PALS, Planning Ahead for LGBT Seniors, of which I was a member and on the steering committee. We asked about 130 older desert-dwelling adults the extent to which they receive emotional support or to whom they turn for emotional support, for short-term help, and for long-term help. There are a variety of options, but if we just choose these kind of individual sources to highlight some of the variations, you see in the darker color here that friends figure prominently across all of these domains, particularly for emotional support. It's almost 70% of these 130 older lesbian, gay, bi, and trans people turn to their friends. About 55% turn to their friends for short-term help, about 40% for long-term help. There's two messages here, I think. One, the prevalence of friends, but two, also the kind of limit of friendship. Now, whether that's friends were unwilling or unable to offer that deeper support sought for long-term help, or whether we as friends were less willing to ask them for that support, that's unclear, and it's an important dimension here, to which I think we can come back to. You see that relatives are second in frequency of those to whom we turn for emotional support, but figure pretty weakly in short-term and long-term help. Neighbors, interestingly, figure more so for short-term help. And sadly, no one, the green bar, is the second largest category of long-term help. And that bar, I must say, was disproportionately populated by men. So we find that across a variety of studies that men are more likely to have no one to whom to turn and to have friends to whom to turn, but difficulty engaging in that negotiation with friends. A study we did several years ago in San Francisco asked about 160 persons living with HIV/AIDS in the Bay Area, similar sorts of questions. Are friends helpful in a variety of different kinds of needs? And just as we've seen before, friends seem to have their strongest influence in providing advice, in encouragement, and in confiding, are also present and in some significant numbers, but less so when it comes time to some of those instrumental activities like shopping, housework, driving, and financial support. So for both LGBT people in general and persons living with HIV, this population, primarily lesbian and gay, friends figure prominently, and their strongest influence is in a kind of emotional support needs. But the notion and the experience of friendship is changing in the US. Most dramatically through the pandemic has probably been your experience and mine, but not exclusively restricted to that. So for example, we have found in our large Canadian study, as have others in this American study, for example, that almost half report losing touch with their friends over the course of the pandemic. Interestingly here, though, those rates are lower for older persons than they are for younger persons. That is to say, older persons were somewhat more likely to have remained in contact than were younger persons over the pandemic. Maybe more familiar with the phone, more used to the nature of that sort of contact. That remains to be seen, but overall there's a decrease or a loss of touch with some friends, less so for older than for younger people. But it's not just a pandemic effect. If you look here at the Survey for American Life, had conducted research over the decades. And so they were able to compare their 1990 results with their 2021 results. And for example, in 1990, Americans, 33% reported that they had 10 or more close friends. By 2021, it was 13%. In 1990, 3/4 of their population, and it's a large population, representative population of US adults, said they had a best friend. It was 59% in 2021. In 1990, 3% said they had no close friends. In 2021, that was up to 12%. And about half the people in 2021 said that they're barely or somewhat satisfied with their number of friends. So there is something happening in friendship, not just by the pandemic, but over the course of decades that there's been a reduction in the number of friends and the satisfaction we have with those numbers. One poll in Evite conducted a survey of primarily younger people, but found that friendships ended, well, first of all, 82% of the sample, and again, they had over 1,000 people, said that lasting friendships were hard to find, and that friendships ended for a variety of reasons. The primary ones listed here: moving away or growing apart, where both parties are too busy, or a sense of betrayal, or not being there when I needed you, a sort of lack of support through a tough time. Almost half of US adults from this survey said they had not made a friend in the past 5 years. And that same number reported that they would go out of their way to make friends if they knew how or had more opportunities. That's the point on which I want to pivot here. I think that we do know how, and there are ways in our grasp, if only we kind of shift the focus of friendship. If we think of almost everything I've said so far, the focus has been on having a friend, right? How many friends do we have? How do we count on our friends? To a much lesser degree, we've addressed being a friend. But in fact, we have to be a friend to have a friend, right? And we don't focus on being a friend. I wonder if it's, and this is the more dramatic me, so pardon this if you feel like rolling your eyes here, but I wonder if the question isn't similar to that posed by Kennedy in an inaugural address. Changed to add friendship, but not ask what your friends can do for you, but what you can do for your friends. Maybe our focus should be on being the friend we want to have, right? And so if we think of that as sort of a perspective, let me turn to another study we did in San Francisco a few years ago, where we asked about 160 participants to talk about the characteristic of what a good friend is. Half were heterosexual, half were gay or lesbian. On the left-hand side are the dimensions that heterosexuals identified as characteristics of a good friend, and you'll see that there's much overlap. But over half said a friend is someone who's loyal and committed. Just over a third said a friend is somebody who's trustworthy. About a quarter said it's somebody in whom I can self-disclose or we could talk about important matters. And about 1 in 5 spoke of both acceptance and sociability. Sociability being, the opportunity to have fun together. Part of the overlap, but gay and lesbian people more strongly endorsed trust, loyalty, and shared values. Almost half or over half for all three of those. 1 in 3 said love or care, and about the same said acceptance. This is relevant, I think, in that if this is what we're looking for in a friend, this is what we can be to our friends, right? I mean, this is what helps us identify the characteristics from which that friendship can develop. I put this up here. It's hard to read and not super important, other than I'm happy to share this with you. But this represents just a quick search of some popular publications where their attention has turned more to the notion of friendship with a little bit of emphasis on being a friend. So there is a shift, I think, in our thinking, and I'm hoping to encourage that, about being a friend. And here you could find some useful strategies of how to be a friend. And I've abstracted those on this next slide. So this represents kind of my summary of those popular reports in the New York Times, in Parade magazine, and in others. But I want to say that I think the framework that guides this is intentionality and empathy. I think we have to be intentional in our friendships. I think as kids and over the course of our early lives, we heard things such as, if you have to work that hard at a friendship, maybe it's not worth having. Well, anything worth having is worth working hard for. And I think that it's true of friendship here. And that's what I mean by intentionality. Empathy, I think, has become in short supply nationally and internationally, but it's critically important for friendship for us to think of the world in this person's shoes. We can't live in those shoes, but we can at least give ourselves a moment to think of what is it like for them. And with these two perspectives, we can now take action, take initiative, show up. That's part of intentionality, is to be there to make time. And we could do a favor today, and it's not a big deal, but I mention it just by virtue of the point here. I drove our neighbors to the airport. Big deal. We live 3 miles from the airport. It was at 4:30 in the morning. I like them. They do a lot for us. I wanted to do that for them. That's kind of being a friend. It made me feel good to be able to support them. There are sort of organizations that could draw our attention, joining a club, some board, or a class. Like Let's Kick Ass would be an organization that would support the development of friendships. PALS is the same thing, planning ahead for LGBT seniors. Scheduling a friend date, making time to have time with another person. And while you're together, be engaged. It's asking questions, being curious of each other's lives. That's the empathic part. And it means listening. Listening isn't a passive activity. Listening is active. It's engaging. It's maintaining eye contact. And when appropriate, sharing part of yourself as well. And it is through this engagement, I think, that friendships can develop. And it also helps to reach out through your network. 40%, for example, of a large study said they made a close friend through their network. 35% said they made a close friend in their neighborhood. People are there. People are craving interactions. We can provide that and sponsor and nurture that by being the kind of friend we want to be. We can stay in touch, cards and emails, and it's not as simple as just forwarding a joke that you've heard, even as that might be fun, but make some connection. I will forward news accounts or photos that I've seen, but not by themselves. It's always, this reminds me of the time when dot, 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 we were together, or I thought this would interest you because of your interest in whatever, right? It's making those connections, reaching out. Another great example, when we lived in San Francisco, we moved down here 6 years ago now, a friend of ours sought to increase his social network, and he was tired of the bars. He had frequented the bars a lot, and knew a lot of people and was a great guy, and but wanted something different. So he would host a weekly Saturday night potluck. He would invite friends and ask them to invite friends, and to set the bar low so that it's not a culinary cook-off. He'd get a frozen lasagna, cook it, but that would be his contribution. So it wasn't about the food, it was about getting together in an informal place with people you're getting to know and wanting to whom you want to reach out. I think it was really successful and a lot of fun. And finally, show appreciation and practice acceptance. I don't mean for this to be pedantic or for me to lecture. This is kind of how I remind myself, is I have to practice acceptance and not to rush it. Not everyone has to be a close friend, right? And we may be looking for someone just to go to movies with, just to walk around the block with. That's fine. Just to be in touch, to be connected with others, and to be the friend you would want to be. So, kind of to summarize here, what I hope I've tried to convey is that in the context of a pretty ambiguous cultural context, ambiguous cultural message, friendships has value, friendship has value. And perhaps that's even more true for us as LGBT people or others who live, quote, marginalized in marginalized communities, that is, outside of kind of traditional heterosexual ideals. I think in general, we are poorly prepared to develop and honor friendship. You know, as kids, there's emphasis given to developing and being a friend. As we grow older, we lose kind of that support. We adopt messages that it's friendships develop naturally. We're not as intentional. And as a consequence, we come to this stage in our life with kind of, I don't know, weak structures to develop and honor friendship. And we have built a system where we focus more on having a friend than being a friend. I think that's part of North American tradition, of focus on number and size, right? That somehow more or bigger is better. And we've kind of applied that to social networks. And we've adopted this kind of competitive language of best friend. We shed those kind of notions and focus on the relationships we have, focus on being a friend rather than having a friend. I think we can open the doors for friendship development and for our development. And I think all of the benefits that are accrued from both of those. And just as a starting point, just to share that July 30th, 2022 is International Friendship Day. Why don't we use that opportunity to send cards to people maybe we haven't talked to, or to call, or to just reach out. It's celebrated much more extensively in other cultures. Many of us probably didn't even know this day existed. Perhaps it's a hallmark moment, but why not us? Why can't we at least capitalize on that? Thanks. I appreciate you being here.
That's wonderful. Brian, thank you so much for being with us today at Aging Positively, the Reunion Project. We're just a few minutes away from Andy Bell. Brian is also joining us live and is open to taking a few questions. I'm going to pull something out of the chat. Hank writes, after losing my entire circle of friends in San Francisco during the 80s and early 90s, for several years, I hesitated to make new friends for fear of going through that kind of loss again. Has other people have other people experienced this and have that hesitancy to make new friends? And Brian, maybe you can speak to that in terms of how do you cope with that?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me, and thanks for that question too. I have heard that and sort of experienced that too, and I can appreciate that hesitancy and feeling like we're going to go through that loss all again. But it's kind of the balance I feel like I have to strike is do I fear going out for being hit by a car, right? And at some point, I feel like I just have to take that risk, and I think the risk is worth taking, both for what I can learn and gain from the friends, but for, again, becoming more the me I'd like to be in that process. So I'd encourage that kind of risk taking and empathize, knowing that there are risks involved, and I think ultimately it's worth it.
And the risk really, I think, is loneliness, right? It's the loss of having that friend, but I think you also have to think back to what did that friendship contribute to your life during that period, however short or long that may be. There's a kind of a long piece that I've seen called "Is Somebody in Your Life for a Reason, a Season, or a Lifetime?" Mm-hmm. And I think that's something that's an interesting thing to contemplate. Is somebody there just for a really reason? Is it there for a season, for a time, or is it somebody who's a lifelong friend?
I think it's a great point, Brad. And also that I've come to realize, I think, that there's I only express certain parts of myself to certain people. Sure. And I've realized that with the death of friends, like the previous question, when my closest friend in Vancouver died, I lost not only him, but I lost part of me. right?
Mhm.
And so I
Yeah.
grieved that part of me, and I think that part was a bit of a inhibition for reaching out in other contexts as well.
Yep, yep, no doubt. Any other questions that may be in the chat? I know, Jonathan, you made note of a cruise that's happening next year. There's an HIVcruise.com, which I think is part of Akaya's cruise to the Mexican coast possibly next year. I'm not sure if that's the one or not. So Jonathan Goldman, thank you for that. So Jeff, thank you for your comment as well. And with that, it's about 12:55.